Everyone literally has the responsibility and power to make the most out of every phase in life. Looking at Nelson Mandela's story, we see how every phase that occurred, there was always things that didn't go the way they would have liked. But there was a common denominator, which was the fact that they all had a choice. So sometimes they were in prison, they decided to stay together, they decided to still hold their meetings, they decided to still, fight using the law, against things, grievances. Sometimes they give them beds with bugs, sometimes their food was watery, sometimes they're just giving them maize that was not really well cooked, like pap, just all manner of things that they had to fight through. But there was this joy anytime they came out. Imagine prisoners coming out and towns have gathered, police had to be, on guard because they fear that, the people would sort of overpower them and, bundle them away. They were given hope and they were prisoners. While they were outside, they were doing the same thing. While they were, outside as, not entirely free, but sometimes they were underground because they were banned from going out. Nelson Mandela and a couple of people, Oliver Tambo and some other people, they were banned from moving around. So they were given restriction orders within Johannesburg in South Africa. So you can't go to the nearest, you can't go anywhere. You're just within the confines of a city. You can't travel, you can't meet people. But still, they were able to effect change, they were able to send their word out. And when they were in prison, their messages were being filtered. So imagine you writing a letter to your wife and then they will filter it. If they find any word or anything that connotes anything political, certain words like peace, war, so they will cut everything out. Imagine them delivering a cut up letter to your wife and she has to now find a way to make out meaning of what you're trying to say. They had no access to newspapers, because it was prohibited. So many things in normal day life. Yeah, we expect that in prison, but this was on another level, because they were just really, really clamping them down to make sure that their opposition power was reduced to dust. But one thing remained. They kept on keeping together, and keeping the dream and the hope alive. Now, having said that, I would also say, lesson number 8 would be that all men have a core of decency, even the most cold-blooded if their heart is touched. I say that again. All men have a tendency at their core they have a core of decency, even the most cold-blooded if their heart is touched. So he discovered this relating with a lot of wordings. Many of these people were brainwashed by the government to think that they were very evil people. By the time they got into prison, Nelson and a couple of others began to interact with some of the wardens, the prison officials, and somehow they began to make some friends with them, and it turned out that some of them became sympathetic to their cause. They began to realize that, the way the government painted these people to us was not actually the way, because we see them, we relate with them every day, and they are human, they relate with us, they are reasonable, and they began to explain the history of the ANC, as African National Congress, and they began to explain why they were fighting and the causes and their philosophies. And little by little, some of the wardens began to become more sympathetic. Sometimes they will allow them certain privileges, that were not supposedly supposed to be banned, So that was a very good sign to show that, even people that seemingly look cold-blooded, at their core, they have a sense of decency if you're able to touch their heart, And that's another lesson to learn. You can't condemn people because of the kind of life they've lived or things they're exposed to that make them so cold-blooded, and then think there's no good in them. Every human has a core of decency. That was a lesson. Another lesson, I would say lesson 9, would be to truly lead, one must be able to collaborate, negotiate war with all camps, victory upon victory. So it's a very core lesson for me, being the fact that if you have different parties, is either you are able to collaborate together, that means work together, or negotiate terms and say, okay, we'll do this if you do this. So you negotiate, or you war, meaning you literally go for the jugular by yourselves. Not one victory, but victory upon victory. That was a catch, meaning that if we cannot negotiate, if we cannot collaborate, then we have to war together. And that warring is not once. We're going to continue doing it over and over. That's victory upon victory. The idea is that one victory doesn't cover all. So after Nelson Mandela was released from prison, after 27 years, the battle continues. He still had to begin to negotiate. So they had moved from warring to negotiating to collaborating. So they warred in the sense that they had to try non-violence, negotiate, go on protesting, but then the police will open fire. So they had to have another militant arm, they called it MK, that was going to, not attack civilians, but more or less, pinch the government. So they would destroy some public facilities in their own way of protesting, a little bit of violence, because the ANC does not stand for violence, according to what I read, but they had to adopt some form of it as a tactic, not as a principle. So meaning that at their core, they don't stand for it, but they just had to, because you are meeting non-violent protesters with violence. So how do you expect them to react? They come in peace, they gather, they riot, you send them back, they don't go, then you start shooting them, people die. So obviously they have to find a way to retaliate. So they had to begin to war, and then at some point they took them to court. It was serious legal battles, months, years of legal battles before they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Then they had to begin to negotiate over and over. Negotiated so many times in prison. Different prison commandants will come. They will have to write requests. Some were very mean, so they will have to reach to their superiors, find a way to still bring them to court while in prison, and defend themselves as lawyers by themselves while in prison. So you can imagine them preparing for a case. You are in prison, you don't even have the resources, but all of this to show that even after the freedom, there was huge celebration. People came from all over the world, people we didn't even expect. It was international, global news. Nelson Mandela is free. But still he had to negotiate with the government. He had to make sure that the terms and conditions, not just for his freedom, but for the freedom of all political prisoners, he began to negotiate. Then at some point, they had to come up with a bipartisan government that will now be subject to an election, and whoever wins, wins. And they actually won with about almost 65% of the vote. That's how they started, gradually transitioning. So it wasn't one victory that finalized it. It had to be constant warring, negotiating, collaborating, just to make sure that things would go well. So they were in between. The government was telling Nelson Mandela to ask the militant arm MK to lay down their violent weapons and stop. But he was also saying, first of all, the government too should also stop being violent with the protesters. So that was a very tough negotiation. Who was going to stop first? If you ask Nelson Mandela's people to stop, there's no how the government can continue being violent with the protesters, and then expect them to stop. So they had to somewhat, come to a stalemate and agree. And then there were some other groups that refused to be affiliated with either of the parties, and they were still becoming very, very, notorious, literally killing. That's now South Africans themselves, killing other South Africans because they were like another group entirely, So the whole country was in turmoil of violence. They had to declare state of emergency, and in the heat of that, people were dying in numbers. 250 people one day, 45 people another day. Just very gruesome death, But at the top of this, Nelson Mandela kept on meeting with the president, even as a prisoner. They had to sneak him into the president's house, and he kept on having to negotiate for the freedom of his people. So these are some of the lessons. I'll take one more lesson. I'll say lesson number 10. I'll say One must learn to adapt quickly because life can change faster than you think possible. Yeah, there's so many lessons here, but I'll end with this one. One must learn, lesson 10, to adapt quickly because life can change faster than you think. I agree, because looking at Nelson's life, so many things changed drastically. He was driving one day, he just arrested him and said, "Oh, he's been banned." Banning means for the next 2 years. I think his first ban was some months, then later they banned him for 2 years. Meaning, imagine you are in a state and you can't leave that state for a period of 2 years, and then they banned him again for another 5 years in your own country where you were born by birthright, because of the claims that he was, being what's it called now, causing uproar around the country, and him meeting with other leaders meant being able to facilitate more negotiations. And so a lot of times, life just changes like that. All of a sudden they try to like disbar him from being an attorney, so he couldn't represent people's cases. He had to fight for his license again. Then another time they just put him in prison. All of a sudden they move him to another facility. So they were having court case somewhere, and his lawyers were able to come, other lawyers were able to come and help him out. Then they just woke up one day, they moved them to another prison far away, because when they were coming to the court, loads of people would come. So they moved the trial to another state. So people will have to travel down just to reduce the number of people and to reduce the support they were getting. So they moved them far away, so they had to drive them and drive them back. So you can imagine all those tactics just to suppress them. But and then they had to now change. At some point they had to become their own lawyers to defend their own case, while still being in terrible conditions in the prison. That's before they were even sentenced to life imprisonment. So looking at the things Nelson had to go through, he has seen life change so drastically. At the point, they had two options: either they were sentenced to life imprisonment or they were going to be hanged. And he had to consider the options. I mean, the face of trial just changed in the twinkle of an eye. At some point, they were thinking they will win. All of a sudden, they just changed the judges. 3 new judges appeared. So life can just change in ways you didn't expect, and if you don't have an ability to adapt, which is innate in every human, but you have to develop it and become better. And for me, I think that wraps up all the lessons I would say I learned from Long Walk to Freedom. And I would say that subscribe, share, and let me know what you think. Thank you very much. I'm John Akinola again, and I'll share more lessons from other books I'm reading. Thank you.